My name's Ryan. I've been freeze drying for about 8 years. My presentation is not a sales pitch. It is stalled. Let's see. There we go. So more of what it is and what it isn't. Is it going to do this to me? It really is. So I'm going to have to try to be careful where I touch. So a lot of people are familiar with dehydrating, but it is not dehydrating. Freeze drying is it operates off of the principle of sublimation, which is basically taking something from an ice form to a gas form and bypassing the liquid form. And it does that very specifically with certain mechanisms in the machine and timing and cycles that it goes through. So it's far more complex than just dehydrating. If you want to dehydrate something, you can get some window screen and a couple of 1x2 sections and build your own dehydrator and stick it outside and it'll do what it's supposed to do. And you just wait, right? It just naturally happens. But the differences are more in the preservation side. So this is a significant form of food preservation, and things will last a lot longer. I've got fruit from the first batches that I did that I've still been testing, and they're still good. And I've been, in the course of doing these presentations over the last 4 years or so, I've met folks who have had freeze dryers, the Harvest Right freeze dryers from the original machines that came out back 20 years ago that are still tapping into their first ones and finding that stuff is intact if it's packaged properly. Freeze drying is very complex. There's a lot of moving parts and pieces that come into play. Dehydrating is not. It's very simple.
Excuse me, there's a machine?
It's a machine. Yep.
Okay.
It's a machine. We'll get into the parts and pieces and what it looks like and how it all works in a minute. Best way to help illustrate this is you see those two photos. There's one here. This is mint that I pulled from my garden that I freeze dried, and this is mint that I pulled from my garden and I dehydrated the same day. These are the results. You can see the difference between them.
Freeze dried.
Yep.
Can we smell them?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. That one's significantly older.
This?
Yeah. Because the ones that you see there I did right before the event. But what you notice is that the color is still there. And in a lot of ways that means that the food hasn't oxidized. It hasn't had the opportunity to change structure yet. So, and the oils is a big part, but it's not oily. So if you're doing tinctures or things of that nature, or if you're powdering it, doing other stuff, and we'll get to powdering in a second, it's a lot more appealing for children as well, because if you give them something that's dehydrated, it doesn't look very appealing. A lot of times things oxidize, they turn brown, not that fancy. Oh, go ahead and keep passing it around. But they're a lot more likely to eat something that is visually appealing, especially if you can preserve that. Another thing, it's a long-term food option, which is good, but it is not foolproof. When it comes to dehydrating, there are some other things that are a little bit more advantageous. So the sublimation process, can you see that okay?
Yep.
Okay. If I need to move, just let me know. So basically it's an old form of food preservation. It has been around for centuries, but only within the last 20 or 30 years it's been made available on the residential scale. Back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they were using it in the military a lot to make your powdered eggs, powdered milk, powdered cheese, stuff like that for the military, because they knew they could ship it out and get it overseas. It would sustain a lot more, and they could deploy it faster. And just add water and good to go. You got meals. In fact, that's how Cheetos came about. I don't know if you're familiar with that. There was a guy who was working on trying to sell these puffed corn snacks, treats, and he couldn't sell them, but he knew that he had something, and he wound up finding a military surplus sale, bought an entire pallet of freeze-dried cheese, and then rolled those things in it. Next thing you know, you got a Cheeto. So, there are things like that have happened that have made freeze-drying a little bit more of a novelty, but it's actually been used for centuries in the Andes Mountains. And what they would do is they would take their fresh fruits and vegetables, they'd walk them up the mountain, leave them overnight, and then go back to retrieve them in the morning. So during that process, it would get so cold in the mountains that it would freeze their food, and then the act of them going down through elevation and heating would actually bypass the liquid phase, and all the frozen component, all the frost essentially would evaporate off, and then they would have essentially a freeze-dried product. So what the freeze dryer does is it takes that same process and makes it a mechanical process so that you don't have to go climbing up a mountain to freeze dry some food, right? So what it does is it takes temperatures under a vacuum down to 40 below. Anytime you put something under a vacuum, you can get colder than cold or warmer than warm, right? Most refrigerators only go to about -4, 5 degrees, just using standard coolant type stuff. But once you put it under a vacuum, you can go a lot lower. So that's what they do. Then it slowly gets heated in various cycles to about 175 degrees Fahrenheit. That's usually above a pasteurization level for most foods. And then water vapor is extracted under a vacuum. So as that happens, it's doing the same thing. It's deep freezing it, and then it heats it up under a vacuum, and all of that heating process gets collected as ice on the outside of the chamber. And then what you do is you pull out the food that is still structurally intact. These are kind of an example of that. These are freeze-dried Cosmic Crisp apples. So go ahead, and you're welcome to have one. Yeah, go ahead and take a piece, and you'll notice that they have a crisp, bright kind of mouthfeel to them, but all the flavor is contained and saved. These are not oxidized. You notice the color and flavor have all remained, and the only thing different is that the water's been removed. So the structure itself is identical to when I put it in. Dehydrating is a little bit different. Like it'll change the structure a bit, and there's some chemical changes with oxidation too. So parts and pieces. How is this machine all made up? Because it is a piece of equipment, and it is something that is a little bit more complex. You're looking at basically a refrigerator or a freezer on steroids. So this is an industrial sized freeze dryer, but I have this image up here because it shows the guts of what's inside of this a little bit more clearly than what you would expect on the shelf at a store or online. So what you will see usually is a door and a machine that looks about the size of a mini fridge or a kegerator, like we call them in Pullman. But this is, you take that skin off and this is what you see. A stainless steel cylinder. Well, let me back up. So the vacuum pump is the first thing. It's a very important piece of equipment. What it does is it puts that chamber under a vacuum, and it maintains a vacuum at all times at various levels to be able to pull that moisture and make sure that nothing else escapes except for the moisture, and nothing else changes. And you can get to those lower temperatures because it does that a couple of times. The door and the seal. The door, this one is a stainless steel one with a viewing window. The ones for Harvest Right are made out of about a 1-inch thick plexiglass type material, and the seal is a rubber seal, so it goes on an outer ring on that cylinder. This one's slightly different, but it's essentially the same thing. You've got a mating surface and a rubber seal. What that does is once that vacuum is engaged, nothing can open that door until you decrease or eliminate that vacuum, either by puncturing it or opening a valve or something like that. So the next one is the compressor hose. That'll go from the vacuum to the pump. It's a physical connection, hand tighten only on those. It's very important you don't use anything that might bind up those threads or anything. Power cords and a freeze chamber. So this is a freeze chamber. You'll see that there are several trays in here. Again, this is an industrial size one. I've seen these things in real life, and they're about the size of this first bay here, between those two posts from wall to wall. They're significant, and you can do a lot with them, but there's some challenges to that and the types of foods you can do that quickly. Like, for example, the apples, if you don't do them fast, they will oxidize as you're working with them. So there are some things that they don't do on a commercial scale because it's hard to actually make them to where they're not as appealing. It can still be done, it just looks different. And sometimes apples over time, they're kind of a weird fruit like that. And then the last thing, the most important part of freeze dryer is the food, right? That's what we're all here for. So on the operational side, this is a component that people need to be aware of when you're looking into a freeze dryer, because after the sticker shock, and if you make that investment, then you have to also consider the operational expenses, what it costs to run and operate this machinery. So you've got the initial equipment cost, power draw, space considerations, and that's something that could cause an expense depending on what you're dealing with in your environment. The food expense, which is a big
How
one.
big is it?
It's about this deep and maybe that wide, about the size of a,
And high.
oh, from the table to here. And then the cycle duration. So food expense and cycle duration, those are things you need to be aware of. And we'll go through each of these individually a little bit more in depth. So the initial power equipment cost, I'm sure you've seen these before. They're about 2,500 to 3,500 bucks. Some of the other ones, there's an extra large one that they've come out with now that's probably on the higher side, maybe 4,000, 4,500. You get, I think, 6 trays or 7 trays or something like that, and it's a slightly larger chamber. So with that, you're going to have a little bit more space. The one that I got is a medium, I believe. It has 4 trays. Each tray can hold roughly a gallon of food or material. That does seem like a lot of money for a piece of equipment, but I kind of tend to think of it on the terms of a new washer or a new refrigerator. A lot of times you're looking at almost that much anyways for a modern appliance, and sometimes they don't work as well as the old ones do.
All the same as far as about a gallon on each tray. Even
I think the larger ones are a little bit bigger. The other trays might be slightly larger. I don't have the specs on that, but you can look it up on the Harvest Right site.
Like a liquid gallon?
Yeah, if you poured a liquid gallon, because I can fill up a 2-gallon or almost 2 gallons worth of material if you process stuff properly and stack it right on the trays. You can get a lot more volume out of them, and we'll talk about that in a second. Don't let me forget.
Okay.
So it's the price. It is a sticker shock. But it is and you're not going to be able to go to like Home Depot and just put it on layaway type of thing. So people don't really do that much anymore, especially not in this region. But it is something that is. It seems expensive, but once you get into what you can potentially get out of it, it might outweigh that cost over time.
So, are they made in the U.S.?
Made in Salt Lake. Yep. And I've talked to the folks at that company. They're great people to work with. Tough to get a hold of, but because there's just one small company, but they send freeze dryers all over the states, and they've of course after 2020 their sales just went right through the roof. But they have been able to maintain a relatively stable price point, so it's not fluctuating too much. Power draw is the next one. That's something that you want to be mindful of. You're looking at roughly about what you would expect for a full-size chest freezer plugged in 24/7. That's if you're using it 24/7 though. So keep that in mind. I never leave mine plugged in if I'm not at home or if I'm not running a cycle. Mostly for power draw issues and stuff like that. But when I did, for a while I was freeze drying apples for a month straight because I wanted to test this thing out and find out what it could do. And that was a bit of a challenge. At most, I think my power went up $20 a month. And that's running full time and at 24/7 for 30 days. So, and if you have alternative sources of power, that could be even less. I just found out that this guy's solar setup has a potential to keep that machine running for free for $2,000. So if you're considering something like that, or if you have some kind of other power source, it might be something that you can tinker with and make it to where it doesn't matter what it costs for power if you're smart about it.
And it doesn't hurt it to have different kinds of power draws?
As long as it's from a stable source. And that's just as stable, if not more stable than the power grid. So, especially when you run, because you're running it through clean power off of a battery setup instead of potential fluctuations with power companies with surges and stuff like that. That's a whole nother topic though.
Yeah.
Space considerations, roughly 10 cubic feet. So we've talked about the size a little bit, but you also want to be mindful of where you put it in your house or in your outbuilding or in your shop or wherever you're planning to put this. You need to be mindful of orientation and what the environment is around the machine, because anytime that you put something under a deep freeze, what is the result of that? Like, what happens when you try and cool something? Heat. You generate a lot of heat. So the first time I had my freeze dryer set up, I put it in my pantry thinking, okay, I'll process all my food in the kitchen, walk to the pantry, put it in the freeze dryer, turn it on, package it, and then I'll just put it on the shelves. Well, after a while of doing that, I realized, man, my pantry's hot now. And it's an earthen pantry, so it's actually built into a hillside. So normally it stayed about 50 degrees, 60 degrees year round. Then I'm starting to see it bump up into the 70s and 80s, and all of a sudden I'm losing food that I'm trying to store up. The freeze-dried food wasn't impacted, but the other stuff was. So keep that in mind. Don't put it in a basement. Don't put it in some sort of enclosed environment. You're going to want to make sure you have some ventilation and some sort of means for cooling the machine if it gets warm. Like windows even is fine. There was one guy who actually found a way down south to be able to block off one end and vent it outside with a 12-volt solar fan. So it was constantly blowing directly outside. It didn't matter what temperature it was inside or outside, really, because it was just constantly moving that warm air out. So, and he was still getting airflow, no problems with his machine, but they have a whole different set of problems in the south with heat and humidity. So keep that in mind. And, it's going to generate heat, but it's also going to generate noise, about 35 decibels. So if you put it in your living room, if you're a single guy by yourself, you just turn up the TV volume and you're fine. But if you got a family and you're trying to have conversations, it's not going to work out too well. So just kind of be mindful of that while that machine's running. Food expense. So when you go to the store, you buy your meats, you buy your vegetables, you buy your fruits. How do you buy those? Like, how are they priced out? Per pound. Everything is per pound, unless it's a prepackaged thing that's like $8 for 10 chicken legs or something like that. So when you're using a freeze dryer, I don't know if you felt how light those were, those apples. You're actually extracting all the water. Water's extremely heavy, and that's exactly what they pump into your fruits and your vegetables and all that other stuff, and you're basically paying for that stuff that you're getting rid of. So you have a limited amount of space in this machine, and you want to get the most out of each batch. So what you need to think about is what you can do by volume. So anything that you can get more of or have higher quantities of, that's what you want to try and chase down. I absolutely love new gardeners. Why?
Getting rid of stuff.
What kind of
Don't know
stuff?
how much to plant yet, so they plant
They
way too much.
overplant. New gardeners always overplant. And then next thing you know, you got people that are offloading all their fruits and vegetables that they've been, not so much fruits, but vegetables and stuff like that. You got zucchinis in the back of the truck because people will do that at my workplace. If you leave your doors unlocked, next thing you know, you got a giant zucchini in there. You don't know what to do with it.
Mailbox.
Your mailboxes, all that kind of stuff. That's where you really want to try and take advantage of this. Fruit trees are my number one fan. And a big part of that is because nobody harvests their own fruit anymore. They've got these old growth fruit trees sometimes, and if you hit them at the right time of year, you can get tons over time, but hundreds of pounds of fruit within a matter of minutes from people who are glad that you're taking it. If you guys know what a boat hook is, it's a telescoping pole with a little hook on the end. They use it to pull boats into the dock. You take one of those and a couple of tarps, go underneath a plum tree when they're ripe and just give it a little tug. Those things will just rain down on those tarps, pick them up, and then you're gone. So there are ways to do that. I harvest all my own blackberries. I go and pick them myself off the river, and for a $5 handful of blackberries that you get at the store, it doesn't make sense to fill up these trays. But I can put in some time and energy and take an afternoon and fill up 5 gallons worth of blackberries and then make a full batch out of my freeze dryer.
I want to know where you're going because I want to do that.
Yep, it can be done. There's plenty of hidey holes, especially down on, yeah. Go out on the west
Our
side.
whole
You can do it.
neighborhood's full of old fruit trees. Nobody.
Nobody does anything with them. Go to town.
Yeah, we do.
Be their friends. And sometimes if people are hesitant, let them know what you're doing and tell them why. Because whenever I have people that are excellent at growing something or who overproduce stuff, since people are overproducing, they're more than happy to get rid of it to someone who's going to use it. But people who are really good at growing stuff, those are the folks that I really try and barter with. So what I'll do is, there's one guy at work who's excellent at growing tomatoes. I mean, he'll grow hundreds of pounds a year, and because he eats them a lot. But you know, I can work with him to, and I'm horrible at growing tomatoes. I'm still trying, but it's an art, and there's a certain level of care that you need to put into doing that. If this guy can do it, but I can't, guess what? I will freeze dry a batch of tomatoes for him, and whatever I freeze dry, my number one rule is I get a cut. What's my cut? Any guess?
25%.
Keep going.
50.
Half. 50%. Anytime I freeze dry something for somebody, my cut is 50%. So if you got hunters that need to clear out their freezers with all the raspberries or blackberries that they picked the year before, guess what? I'll freeze dry those raspberries for you so you can have room for your meat and your elk or fish or whatever you're doing. But my cut's 50%. And most people are happy to get back something because they're getting something that's going to last longer on the shelf, and I get something I didn't even have to work for. So that's one of the ways that you can turn that money part around a little bit. Time is another thing. So 32 to 36 hours a batch is typical for this region. If it's really hot, or if it's really humid, or if it's really cold, those extreme environments will make the machine work harder to do its thing. So the best way to make it full advantage of this machine is to do it on the shoulder seasons. Catch it end of September to November, December, and then March, April, May, up to probably the end of June. Not a whole lot that you can harvest freshly on that time frame, especially the later part of the year. So what I advise people to do with their foods is, if it can be frozen, it can be freeze dried. In almost every instance. Butter's an exception, but for the most part, if you can freeze it, you can freeze dry it. So if I wind up getting my hands on stuff, I front load my freeze dryers as much as I can during harvest season, and I do it in a specific way so that throughout the fall and into the spring, I can still run my machine and keep it going. And then during the summer, I don't necessarily use it a whole lot. A couple reasons. One of them is safety, and another one is stability of the machine. During wintertime, I have a lot of power outages, so there's a problem with that. If you have unstable power and your power drops in the middle of a 32 to 36 hour cycle, you're going to lose the batch, depending on how long that power shortage is. If it's a matter of minutes, you might be okay. If you're looking at a day or two, it's done. You may as well just pull the vacuum and empty the stuff out before it rots in your freeze dryer. So the other thing to be mindful, I said I don't leave it on when I'm gone. I also don't use it during fire season for obvious reasons. The last thing I'll go through and, take a video of it, or, go around my house and take videos of what I have just in case something should happen, but I'm not going to get any warning if something like that happens. So I generally don't use the machine around that time frame. So if I'm looking at power outages, weather failures, anything like that, something that is out of my control, I don't want it ruining the machine. So I pull it out of service and use it when I have a little bit more stable environments. And when I was doing that for a month at a time, or for a full month, that is extremely awkward to try and adjust to a 32 to 36 hour cycle, because I would do something, and then most of us are on a 24-hour cycle, so I'd be leaving work at lunchtime to go and change out the batches, do something, and then come back, at 3 a.m. to pull the batch and put another one in and stuff like that. So when I meant running it 24/7, I was running it 24/7, and that's not typical. Typically, you could do it, and then you're looking at maybe, I was getting 5 batches per week. Realistically, you're looking at maybe 3. So on the troubleshooting side, what can go wrong? A lot of parts and pieces here. Can you troubleshoot it? Are you competent enough to be able to open this machine and see what's going on with it? You should be. You don't have to be, but you should be, because help is not necessarily on the way if something should fail. They will charge you to work with you at Harvest Right. It is not, they don't have free customer service or free tech service. You will have to pay, and it's worth it to pay for it if you got a real problem. But you will have to pay, which is unfortunate, but I get it, because otherwise they're going to get 50 million phone calls asking, well, hey, my machine won't turn on, and then they're got to tell them to go flip the breaker or trip the, So there's things that they do to prevent that from happening, which is good, but the other side of that is you might not be able to get a hold of these people, and you might not be able to get help, so you need to understand how the machine works before you get too deep into it. Can it be repaired? Anybody here know any electricians? Maybe? Anybody who knows, anybody who can work with circuit boards, or maybe a welder in case you get a crack in that cylinder somewhere, or maybe an HVAC guy, someone who knows how AC works, someone who might be able to do a little sweat a copper line or something like that. Those are your best friends and connections that you want to make. And guess how you make connections with people like that?
You just have to marry
You can marry them. You can marry one. That's usually a pretty good way to do it. You'll never have a, yeah. No, I won't go that way. Who makes the repair? Is it you? You're going to pay someone to come do that? You're going to pay the guy? Well, they do have services that'll do that, but be mindful that that's going to add up in the end, like the costs of operation for this. How do you get parts or consumables for this? Do you have mason jars on hand? Do you have other storage containers on hand? How are you going to be able to maintain the other stuff that you might need? Oil is another one. They use a very specific vacuum pump oil. Do not use motor oil. Don't use transmission oil. It'll kill you. So you have to use vacuum pump oil that's a food grade vacuum pump oil. What if you're forced to evacuate? Or if somebody comes to your house to rob you? You're going to have to forfeit it. Nobody's gonna steal a Harvest Right freeze dryer out of your pantry, by the way. So don't be too worried about that. That's why I share with people, hey, look, I'm happy to, take a gallon of raspberries off your hands and I'll freeze dry it and give it right back to you. I don't mind. I like letting people know that I have this machine, because the more people that know, more people that come to find me, and that's the more product that I can actually get out of it for free. So that is advantageous to me. But if I have to evacuate, that changes things. It ain't going with me. I'm not packing this thing around. They're about 300 pounds. And it's going to take at least 2 people to get it moved from one location to another. By the way, I did move mine out of my pantry to an outbuilding, and it works better that way. I don't have any noise issues. It's isolated, free from any kind of disturbances, and it's got the right ventilation and power that I need. So that might be an alternative. I mean, if you're putting it in a shop, just be mindful. Oil mists and consumable oils can mix, and you don't want to mess with any of that. So make sure it's in a sanitary location. What happens if you have mid-cycle power failure? You have to make sure that you're planning for energy and potentials for that. We talked about that a little bit already. Is your food intact after storage? Okay, sad story. I spent a month freeze drying apples because I wanted to be able to sell them. I wanted to be able to sell them on a large scale and be able to, make a couple bucks, buy another machine, and continue to go. Just doing farmers markets and people at work, stuff like that. So I went in whole hog. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find cheap apples. I'm going to get them as quick as I can, fill up my refrigerator, go through and do all this kind of stuff. And what I found right away is that sometimes you get food and you have to figure out how to store it while you're processing, because you can lose a lot of food in 32 to 36 hours if it spoils, and that's only one batch. So I found myself moving a refrigerator and packing it full of apples from top to bottom. Okay, so you need to make sure that you can process the food before it expires. If you can't process it, freeze it so that you can. I do advise that when you freeze food, especially small things like berries, freeze them flat on a baking pan and then put them directly in the freezer that way. If you want, you can stack them layers. Just make sure that the pans aren't squishing each other. Put some spacer in between. And then when you do that, pull them out when they're frozen, and then you can put them in a Ziploc bag. Because that way you can pour them out of the Ziploc bag. What happens when you put a bunch of berries in a Ziploc bag in the freezer?
They mush together.
They mush together and you pull out a block of something that gets thrown away 2 years later. So that way you can actually have more control over the material and the dosages that you're putting into your machine. So if you can't process it, freeze it.
Can you mix different fruits?
Yes, you can. You can mix all kinds of stuff. I've had chocolate with onions. I've had broccoli with fruits. I've had all kinds of stuff mixed together. No problems. You don't have any flavor interchanges or anything like that. As long as your stuff is clean and you've wiped it out properly, then you're usually good to go. The trays are stainless steel. They can go in a dishwasher. You can wash them by hand. I generally do that because it's faster. And there's some other things that you can do to kind of get a little bit more out of those machines. Extra parts and pieces to keep on hand. So mine broke a couple of times during that, as a result, probably during the course of ownership. There are 4 modules inside this machine. So this is a typical Harvest Right freeze dryer. Right above this, you open it up, take that skin off, and there's 4 modules on the top. This machine does 3 things. It heats, it cools, and it controls a vacuum. So what's that 4th module for, you think? It's a plug, like a fuse almost. No? It's a spare. So that you can be back up and running or find out if you've got an issue with the machine and do it yourself. So you have one spare that you can pull a module, put that spare in, and see if your machine goes back to life. Maybe the vacuum's not working, maybe the heat's not working, you know, your batches are failing. Well, that is their remedy for us so that we can actually fix it ourselves if we need to. So having more of those modules on hand, it's a good idea. I've got a couple of them in a drawer that I have set aside just for that. Vacuum pump oil. If you have the oil version, which I recommend, I haven't heard great things about the vacuumless pump. It's expensive and I don't know that it works as well. But they do have, the basic one comes with a vacuum pump that requires oil. You got to change that oil out on occasion. So you need access to pump oil. I do not use the Harvest Right pump oil because it's expensive and I don't see any difference with that oil and the kind that I use. I use a food grade vacuum pump oil that is used in the milk industry. What do they use vacuums for in the milk industry? Milking cows. So it's designed to be able to pull with that same thing. It's a food grade and it's blue. Usually you can get them by the gallon at farm and home stores, or you can order them online. The pump is nice to have a spare. They are expensive, but if it goes out, you're dead in the water. And there's not much you can do unless you know someone who can do pump repair. You might be able to take them to an HVAC repair shop. Sometimes they work with enough of that stuff to be able to repair those pumps or have gaskets that they can make. Condenser coils is another thing. If you have anyone who knows anything about radiators, that's your guy. So your condenser coils aren't something that you're going to be able to get off the shelf at a parts place. But they're about the size of an ATV or four-wheeler or dirt bike cooling system. In a pinch, you could probably swap one out. Adequate food storage methods is a big one. So another sad story. My apples that I was talking about, I was mass producing them, and then I would take them and I'd dump them into these Ziploc bags because I was like, okay, I'll go ahead and package them and I'll put them in Ziploc bags, and then when I'm ready to sell them, I'm going to put them in a gusset sack, right? But I didn't have enough gusset sacks, and I was kind of waiting because I was doing it in the fall, and I was planning to have this stuff ready for farmer's market in the spring. So about a month or two before the farmer's market, I go back into my stash, and this is what I find. Every single one of them had failed.
Yeah, the oxygen or the moisture got inside.
So, as it turns out, Ziploc bags are not an adequate storage method for long-term freeze-dried food. I have about 10 Bankers boxes full of apples that failed, which is a lot, and it's heartbreaking. So learn from my mistakes and make sure that if you are going to package your material, you package it in something that cannot take on moisture. And unfortunately, while those are waterproof, they're not moisture proof. Here's another example. These were done at the same time.
Okay. And is this the difference in lids? So this
Yep.
one was with this lid. Okay.
Difference in
these
lids.
ones are not.
Well, look at it.
They, would the leak-proof one, like, I don't think you'd want to spend that kind of money when you could do this. But
Yeah,
those leak-proof ones, would they let that happen?
possibly. There's not enough of a gasket on that to be able to prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
So you'll notice that broccoli, that's completely failed. That can happen too. So you got to make sure that your containers are watertight. It's very important. I won't go too much more on that. Hoses and cables, those are easy enough to get. The cable that's used for this is the same as what's on the back of a standard computer. It's that weird 3-prong one. On the female end, it goes in like a 12, what do you call it, a power supply. Oh, you can send those back.
No.
Yeah, that way folks can look at them.
Is it too late? It's too late, isn't
No,
it?
it's fine.
Okay.
No, I'm still talking. Yeah, there you go. Heating elements are another one. There's each of these trays has a heating element beneath it, excuse me, and it's actually glued to the trays. So if they fail, you almost always have to replace the whole shelf unit, not the trays, but the shelves. And it is nice to have extra shelves, by the way, so that you're not sitting there, like when you're ready to do a batch, if your shelves are dirty, then you're gonna sit there and have to clean them and wait for that to be done. And sometimes it's nice to freeze stuff on those trays, because then when you're ready to put them in, you just take them right out of the freezer and put them in the freeze dryer. You're not doing anything. Remember I was telling you putting it on a baking sheet? They're about the same as a baking sheet, so just put them right on top. So what you can expect when things go right, this is some of the good news. If you do it right, a routine operation can generally produce food from waste, especially among things like, what do you call them, food banks, stuff like that. A lot of times they can't get rid of enough fresh fruits and vegetables. They generally spoil before they can use them. So you can take advantage of that kind of stuff as well. Thanks, appreciate that. Discard or off-season sales. What happens after Christmas every year?
Everybody rushes out and buys their stuff for next year.
Yeah.
Their paper and
So, how about, let's try this. What happens after Thanksgiving every year?
everybody goes to sleep.
Yeah, everybody goes to sleep, right? And then you wake up the next day,
Oh, Black Friday.
Black Friday.
Friday.
What happens to turkeys after Thanksgiving? You can get $2.75 a pound the day before Thanksgiving, or 78 cents a pound the day after Thanksgiving.
Nice.
What happens after Halloween each year?
But pumpkins are
Pumpkins.
over.
What happens after Christmas? Hams. What happens after St. Patrick's Day? Corned beef and cabbage, right? So if you, I traditionally will eat salmon for Christmas or Thanksgiving because nobody's buying salmon. So the price of salmon is down in the toilet and I can get good fillets. The next day I go and have Thanksgiving and I do it on a fraction of the price. If you do the same thing with your food management with these, even if you're going to buy food instead of just the fruits and stuff, then yeah, go for it. That's how you can kind of do that stuff. Typically you get 1 to 3 gallons of food per batch and 3 to 5 cycles per week. 3 is going pretty consistently. On average, the normal person might do 1 or 2 a week, okay? And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. The more you use it, the more useful it is. But if you go full stream, full speed ahead like I did, realistically, 1 to 3 gallons of food, 3 to 5 times a week, that's a net of 156 to 780 gallons of food per year that you can put up. You're going to struggle to find places to put this stuff if you actually use it properly. Considerable cost savings, space savings. This is another thing too. So I had 4 of these size jars. This is a quart jar, I believe,
Yeah, wide one.
full of plums. And I needed to get those quart jars back because I needed them for another batch. So I reduced them to powder. This is one of the lesser known things or lesser utilized things when it comes to freeze drying, powdering stuff. powdering sauces, powdering other stuff. I mean, tomato sauce, anything that you can reconstitute quickly, or soups, throw in a smoothies. That's why I did these. Plum powder is extremely sweet. You're welcome to try some. I don't have a spoon or anything, but you're welcome to try it.
What would you use that in?
You can. I use it in kombucha. Yeah. So I'll just kombucha. You know what kombucha is, or soda, because you can sit there and pour it in there, and then as it settles down, you don't have all the pulp and all that stuff. You just have a powder that resides on the bottom. It's very clear. You get the color and all the flavor out of it, and by volume, you actually have more plums and less water, so it's more concentrated of flavor. So some people will also take this to the same kind of level when it comes to, can I tap into some of your time? Is that okay? I'm almost done. Some people will go with tinctures as well. So if you take all the water out of something, you know what a tincture is?
Yeah.
Yeah. You take all the water out of something, and then you infuse it with alcohol. Guess where that alcohol's going? It's going into the material. It's going to reconstitute it inside there. So you're going to get a more concentrated form of that with tinctures, salves, things like that. So, barter potential is another one. Unlimited. I've gotten bottles of wine. I've gotten work. I've gotten all kinds of stuff by bartering. I've gotten free food, obviously, by being able to do that. So,
Eggs, is there a trick on those?
say again, eggs?
Eggs,
Yeah, you can do eggs. Usually they'll,
what, scramble them up and put them on the
yeah, I wouldn't cook them first. Some people do, but it's better, I think, to do them raw, and then they'll turn into a flake when they're out, and then you can just have them like in a powdered form, and then you can scramble them. I have done pickled eggs. Don't do that. It's gross. One thing about freeze drying is that when you pull all the water out of something, every flavor comes out in leaps and bounds. I mean, it's unbelievable. But that means every flavor comes out. So your vinegar from a pickled egg is all you taste and smell. Okay?
Cucumbers, can't do cucumbers. It's pure salt.
Yep. Other stuff. Now, with that in mind, cucumbers, what about celery? Celery salt, onion salt, garlic salt. That's how they do it. They powder it and mix it with salt, and then you have that. Okay? That simple. Where was I going with that, though?
Somebody do avocados.
Yep.
You can make guacamole.
Yep. Same
Freeze
thing.
dry it.
So, barter potential, where was I going with that? Oh, lost it. So, what to do if things really go bad? So, let's say we are in it, and you have a freeze dryer, you happen to have power for whatever reason. Where do you go if you absolutely need parts and pieces? Because Harvest Right is not answering their phones, and you have no other resources available. You can't get on YouTube, whatever. So, a couple of opportunities. If you can't get something at Home Depot, universities always use freeze dryers. They use them for other stuff. They use them for research. Sometimes they actually have the Harvest Right freeze dryers that they're using, but a lot of times they have great big ones, or they have the parts and pieces, especially those vacuum pumps, because research often depends on putting something under a vacuum. So if you can do that, or if you have access to it, that's an opportunity. Right now, you can go to a university. There's several of them in this region, or even on the west side, if any of you folks are from the west side. Type in the university name in a web search, and then after that, type surplus. What that'll do is take you usually to the university surplus website, where they will sell stuff for pennies on the dollar. And every so often, you'll get scientific equipment that's been used for something else that happens to be capable of being used for a freeze-drying piece of equipment. Lab environments, pumps and hoses, stuff like that. HVAC shops, another option. Medical facilities, pharmaceutical companies, sometimes if they have that. Milking facilities, processing plants, and vendor locations. Know where your stuff is. If you're out of pump oil, or if you got a major issue and you need it now, you better know where to get it within a half hour's drive, because otherwise you're going to be wasting food, time, and potentially money. So take the time, do what you can now. What do we have left? get your local food sourced out today. If you have a resource, jump on it. Barter if you can. Take the time to harvest yourself, because it is time and money well spent. Advertise with caution and, advertise and promote with caution and intent. Like I said before, I have no problem telling people that I have a freeze dryer, but I have an intention, because I want people to be able to bring me stuff so that I can get, how much? 50%. I'll take it. Source backup power if it's a concern of yours, and then make sure you have your spare parts and pieces on hand. I am out of time. Real quick, I have these available for sale if you guys want them. They're $5 a jar, and I will pack them up and get off stage if you guys are interested. The only thing else that I wanted to say is that when you reconstitute your food, you're going to want to have clean water. This is a product that I'm promoting. It's called Roving Blue, and they actually, it's an ozone filter. Basically what it does is it pumps ozone into water to purify it. It's the same thing that they do at large-scale food production facilities to clean like cranberries in their giant pools. That's what they do to sanitize it. And what it does is it will pump oxygen into water in the form of ozone, and all bacteria and viruses can't survive in an oxygen-rich environment. So it essentially, if you have water that is at least somewhat clean, even from a creek or a stream, this is something that will actually work really well for filtration. It's USB rechargeable, Qi rechargeable. So if you have a wireless charging device, it connects that way. And I'll show. I got a promo code for you. They were able to work with Nalgene and get their proprietary thread. So this particular version just threads on the top.
What kind of bottle?
A Nalgene bottle, just a standard Nalgene bottle. And then you turn it on, flip it upside down, 30 seconds later you've got water that's been purified. I take these packing with me. I take them anytime I'm on a plane or anywhere in a public environment where I don't have my well water at home. I have a promo code for 20% off of these. So if you're interested, I'll show you over here.
How long do they last?
The charge lasts, you could probably do it half a dozen times before it starts to get weak. But I don't know, thousands. This is 32 ounces, and every time I fill it up, I hit it with a filter. So, thanks everybody, appreciate it. We'll head over to the side and let this gentleman take over.
Well, that's all I have for this video. Bang around that bell icon if you want to be notified when new videos come out. Call us on the hotline if you have comments or questions and want to be featured in an upcoming video. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe. Check us out on the website, and we'll see you guys on the next one.